What are you listening to?
The Shins. You know them?
No.
You gotta hear this one song. It'll change your life.
At a time when rock music charts were dominated by butt rock bands like Nickelback and nu metal bands like Trapt, indie rock kind of felt like a secret someone let you in on. But by 2011, indie rock had officially made it.
Thank you, the Grammys. Thank you, everyone. We're so happy.
Arcade Fire winning Album of the Year was absolutely a victory lap for fans of indie music, but it does raise a much bigger question. How did a genre built on independence, DIY ethics, and anti-corporate credibility become one of the most marketable sounds of the 21st century, and why did nobody seem to mind? TV and movie soundtracks aside, indie music was nearly inescapable during its peak in popularity.
Holiday, oh, holiday. Let me go home. I belong with you. You belong. Let's go out back tonight.
In many ways, the style referred to as indie has lost nearly all meaning, with albums like Taylor Swift's Folklore taking on the indie folk tag, or the first 3 songs on Spotify's Best Indie Songs of 2025 playlist being distributed by major labels. So what does indie even mean, and how did we get to where we are today? That's what I'm going to answer in this video. Before we talk about the true birth of the indie scene, I want to examine its rise into the mainstream and the bands and sounds that contributed to its success. And look, there are way too many bands to possibly cover them all or even get close. The bands also span almost too many genres to count, making this section even more challenging. If I left off one of your favorite bands, I'd love to hear who they are in the comments. The Strokes released their debut album, Is This It?, in 2001, and were widely hailed as being the saviors of rock at the time, and really kicked off what is referred to as the garage rock revival. They looked cool, but more importantly, they sounded different than the highly produced mainstream rock at the time, which was mostly nu metal and butt rock. They looked kind of messy in this effortlessly cool way. Alex Turner really spoke for all of us when he said,
I just wanted to be one of the Strokes.
Perhaps the most ironic part is that Is This It was released on a major label. That same year, the White Stripes released White Blood Cells, which has been named one of the best albums of all time by numerous outlets, despite only peaking at number 61 on the Billboard 200. Beyond the music, the band had so much strangeness surrounding them, from the outfits, to the fact that Jack and Meg were a divorced couple playing brother and sister, to being a two-piece band that made them really stand out. The band drew heavy inspiration from 60s and 70s rock, with big catchy riffs and pop sensibilities. They kicked off an entire garage rock revival, with other bands like the Hives and Vine seeing mainstream success, eventually spawning a second wave of highly influential artists like Yeah Yeah Yeahs, The Killers, and Kings of Leon in the US, and Block Party, Franz Ferdinand, and Arctic Monkeys in the UK. These indie rock bands made the genre feel authentic again, at least giving the appearance of being detached from corporate influences.
I'll follow you into the dark.
Around the same time, indie folk and pop-leaning bands started rising in popularity, thanks in part to help from mainstream media.
Hey, do not insult Death Cab.
It's like one guitar and a whole lot of complaining.
With bands like Death Cab for Cutie, The Shins, Iron and Wine, Fleet Foxes, and my personal favorite band at the time, Bright Eyes. Not only did indie folk appeal to the quiet, shy kid, it also appealed to the NPR dad. You know, this guy. Or this guy. The kind of music that became the soundtrack for coffee shops, drawing parallels to folk heroes like Bob Dylan, while serving as the perfect background music in a coming-of-age film. This movement will come back as a defining sound of indie around 2012 and probably cause the death of the whole indie boom by taking it fully mainstream and removing any cool factor that was remaining. I'm talking about bands like the Lumineers and the Head and the Heart, who were later rebranded as Stomp Clap and sounded like indie folk cooked in a lab by record executives. I believe that the peak of indie music popularity occurred somewhere around 2012, with 2 bands at the forefront of the movement, Arctic Monkeys and Arcade Fire. For this video, we'll simply refer to them as the festival bands. These are bands that not only broke into the mainstream, but went on to headline festivals like Coachella and Glastonbury, all while having very different sounds from each other. Arctic Monkeys released AM in 2013, which transcended indie status, incorporating hip-hop and blues influences and using new instruments like vintage drum machines and whatever this thing is. It was the second fastest selling album of the year. It went 4 times platinum in the US, and Do I Wanna Know is the 18th most successful song in Billboard alternative chart history. I mean, one of the biggest pop stars in the world, Dua Lipa, has covered the song, and while their 2006 debut album had about as much hype as Is This It by The Strokes,
Don't believe the hype.
the band packaged AM in a much more digestible mainstream format. Arcade Fire had also been building an audience for years when they released The Suburbs in 2010, which won the Grammy for Album of the Year.
Thank you, the Grammys. Thank you, everyone. We're so happy.
BBC called it the band's OK Computer. Arcade Fire were no stranger to non-traditional instrument choices themselves with their anthemic chamber pop, but broke through the mainstream much the same. And of course, you can't forget bands like Tame Impala, LCD Soundsystem, and the 1975, who are all top contenders for festival headliners, spanning yet even more genres from psychedelic pop to new wave. Tame Impala is an especially interesting case, managing to break through to pop radio in 2015 with Currents, and specifically the track The Less I Know The Better, and like the others in this category, making it onto every Best of the Year and Decade charts. The band, who's really just Kevin Parker, went on to collab with Kanye, Travis Scott, A$AP Rocky, and Rihanna, with Rihanna covering the band on her 2016 album. Currents is probably the most indie album in this entire video. Kevin literally recorded, produced, and mixed the whole thing in his home in Australia with some beat up vintage equipment. The last wave of popular indie we'll call the sad girl indie era for simplicity. While these artists may span some different genres, from folk to pop to country to lo-fi, they tend to have a similar vibe, the true coffee shop soundtrack. Phoebe Bridgers is the first to come to mind, but there are so many talented artists out there that fit in this category. Faye Webster, Waxahachie, Big Thief, Soccer Mommy, you get the point. This sound started gaining traction somewhere around 2015, but I'd say Lana Del Rey's influence with video games years prior can't be understated. Female artists are consistently putting out the best indie music still after a decade, and Phoebe Bridgers still has a death grip on the scene, with Boy Genius winning several Grammys in 2024. I'd be lying if I said the typical Spotify indie playlist didn't get stale a few years back, but I do think indie may be entering another golden age, with bands like Geese, Magdalena Bay, Wet Leg, and Joe carrying the torch. While the bands I mentioned are all over the genre spectrum, from garage rock to folk to electronic to psychedelic pop, you may notice some genres that are distinctly missing. Hip hop, metal, punk, country, EDM, you know, most genres. That wasn't an accident, and independent artists in these other genres don't really get the indie title. I mean, sure, we've seen some crossover. Remember this song?
I fly like paper, get high like planes. If you catch me at the border, I got visas in my name.
But generally, artists in those genres really don't get the indie tag, despite playing alongside all of the indie giants at the Pitchfork Festival. If indie is truly defined by bands on independent record labels, then why does the Wikipedia page not mention those other genres? And why are indie icons like Yeah Yeah Yeahs, who released their first 4 albums on major labels, considered indie? To help answer that, let's first talk a bit about the history of independent music. There are currently 3 record labels that are referred to as the major labels, which are Universal Music Group, Sony Music Group, and Warner Music Group, of the more than 8,000 total record labels worldwide. Every other label is either under the major labels or quote unquote independent from the major labels, hence the name indie. If you care anything about fairness and the little guy, you may want to get ready to take the black pill, because even looking at indie labels in the most favorable way, they only own about 20% of the current market, or in other words, are responsible for 20% of music revenue generated. The three major labels have the other 80%. And you may be thinking, hey, the Strokes didn't release Come Down Machine on a major label, they released it on RCA. Well, RCA is just one of the 4 big labels under Sony Music Entertainment, which is a subsidiary of the Sony Group Corporation. Sony also happens to invest in Epic Games, who invests in Songtradr, who owns Bandcamp, and is also a minority stakeholder in Spotify alongside BlackRock. Dark times. The record label rabbit hole runs deep. We also have something called imprints, like Phoebe Bridgers' quote-unquote label, Saddest Factory, which released her second album. While Saddest Factory is called a label, it's kind of like a brand under the parent label Dead Oceans. Imprints are a way for artists to appear a little more underground or independent than they truly are by obscuring connections to larger labels. And trust me, just being on an indie label doesn't mean being free of corporate influence in 2025. Believe it or not, the Lumineers are actually an indie band signed to indie label Dual Tone Records under the independent Monarch Music Group. According to Wikipedia, Monarch Music Group was formed in 1987 as a music division of Koch Entertainment, which was acquired by and absorbed into Entertainment One in 2004. E1 was acquired by toy and multimedia company Hasbro in 2019, absorbed in its Family Brands division in the process, and then sold to the Blackstone Group in April 2021. Nothing screams indie label like being owned by Hasbro before being sold to a private equity firm. That said, independent labels are in general way more friendly to artists than the majors, both in revenue splits and artistic control. There are almost too many major label disputes to count.
Like, Columbia Records, y'all. Columbia Records, SMD.
From pop stars being artificially delayed from releasing albums,
I can't make an album right now. I'm not allowed to
music ownership disputes, weird forced marketing techniques, and pressure to remove songs from albums. Compare this to your typical independent artist's sentiment of their label, and there is a night and day difference.
They just understood where I was coming from as a small musician trying to figure things out.
Now, not all indie labels are owned by private equity, and this is certainly not how the scene got started. Indie labels were largely formed by DJs, record store owners, or bands who wanted to release albums for themselves or their local scene. It was a way for small artists to get their music out there. This meant these bands generally had the freedom to make the music they wanted, however, usually with very limited financial resources.
We get a pretty good deal with our local label, and as I say, we're allowed to do exactly what we want. Big labels, although they can give you a lot of backing and they can give you plenty of gigs to do, stuff like that, we can find that doing it our own way, we're doing it at the time and with the sort of speed that we want.
Independent record labels date all the way back to the 1940s. Probably the most notable example, Sun Records, was recording early Elvis and Johnny Cash tracks in the 1950s. The label was started by Sam Phillips, a radio DJ who opened his own modest recording studio and label, a theme that would continue into the future. While Sun was a success, independent labels generally couldn't compete with the majors and didn't start to gain a true hold until the 1970s with the punk rock movement. In the mid-1970s, the Ramones were spearheading the New York punk scene and were signed to indie label Sire Records, recording their debut album in only 7 days for $6,400, an almost laughable budget in 2025. To put it in perspective, Green Day's American Idiot, another legendary punk album, cost $650,000 in 2008. At the same time, Sex Pistols were leading the UK punk scene before releasing their only album, Nevermind the Bollocks, in 1977, which we may never have gotten to hear if it wasn't for, at the time, indie label Virgin Records. Virgin was started by billionaire Richard Branson and friends in 1972, following the success of their infamous record store. Sex Pistols were signed and dropped by two major labels, EMI and A&M, before being picked up by Virgin because of their non-brand friendly image, a problem that prevented many punk bands from achieving mainstream success. The late 1970s and 1980s would see a ton of new indie labels pop up, largely centered around local music scenes and bands. The Buzzcocks self-released their debut EP, Spiral Scratch, on a label they created called New Hormones, with a total of $750 they had to borrow from friends and family to finance the production of 1,000 physical copies and the recording and mixing of the record, which was completed in a total of 5 hours. New Hormones became the first English indie label created by a punk band. Similarly, Minor Threat members created punk label Discord to release music from their prior band Teen Idols. The label would go on to release music from prominent DC punk and hardcore adjacent bands like Fugazi, Rites of Spring, and Jawbox, and truly embodied the DIY lifestyle of punk and independent labels. Bands such as Fugazi would be pivotal in influencing the formation of the alternative rock and college rock scene that would follow. It may be harder to find a band from the 90s and 2000s that isn't influenced by Fugazi than one that is. College rock bands like REM, The Replacements, Pixies, and The Smiths combined post-punk, new wave, and pop rock. These bands valued experimentation over radio hits and defined the sounds of the mainstream indie movement that would follow. Sub Pop, located in Seattle, Washington, was founded in 1986 and has remained a key part of the indie scene since, signing a little band called Nirvana in the 1990s and releasing Bleach on the independent label before they saw complete mainstream success. Sub Pop would go on to put out records from so many big indie names, from Fleet Foxes to the Postal Service to the Shins, just to name a few. The indie scene of the 1990s was dominated by Britpop bands like Oasis and Blur, with genres like emo, psychedelic, and slacker rock maintaining underground success in the US, leading up to the big breakthrough around 2001. Look, there were many factors that influenced the explosion of indie rock into the mainstream in the early 2000s, but arguably one of the most responsible would be a little show called The OC, a primetime teen drama that aired on Fox from 2004 to 2007. Seth Cohen, one of the core characters, was the nerdy, quote-unquote nice guy who was definitely relatable to me and to a lot of the anti-jock type kids that gravitated towards music. He often expressed his love for Death Cab for Cutie.
Hey, do not insult Death Cab.
It's like one guitar and a whole lot of complaining.
Who performed on the show in season 2 alongside other indie mainstays like Modest Mouse and The Killers. The show premiered singles from artists like Coldplay and The Shins and released 6 soundtracks, which were a major reason for the show's popularity. Garden State, a romantic comedy starring Zach Braff and Natalie Portman, also released in 2004 and placed a similar emphasis on music, and specifically indie rock, from the iconic scene where Natalie Portman introduces the Shins to Zach Braff, to the incredible soundtrack that won a Grammy for Soundtrack of the Year. Zach Braff described his inspiration for the soundtrack as, essentially, I made a mix CD with all the music that I felt was scoring my life at the time I was writing the screenplay. And what an epic soundtrack. Coldplay, The Shins, Nick Drake, Iron and Wine, all before a lot of these acts had much attention. The movie exploded the Shins' career in a way they really weren't ready for. Even the vice president was talking about the soundtrack.
We get a call from Sub Pop again and they say the movie came out last week or something and it's a hit movie. And not only that, the scene is Natalie Portman. We didn't know Natalie Portman was going to be in the movie. It's crazy.
And hey, there are many more examples of the influence of media on indie's rise.
Please help me welcome the cool, the crazy, the fabulous Flaming Lips.
The Flaming Lips appeared on Beverly Hills 90210 in the 1990s. Grey's Anatomy featured bands like the Postal Service on its soundtrack. Then we also had all of Michael Cera's movies with heavy indie music underpinnings. Juno featuring Kimya Dawson, Nick and Nora's infinite playlist of indie bands, and Scott Pilgrim, which featured a bunch of fictional bands made up of real indie stars. And then there were the infinite TV ads. Oh, and Jay-Z attending Grizzly Bear concerts. There's no doubt that indie music was popular, appealed to the demographic that were watching dramas and coming-of-age type movies, and at the same time unique enough to create some buzz around a soundtrack. These songs were also cheaper for studios to license. At the end of the day, it was kind of a no-brainer. Okay, we talked about how there's no quote-unquote indie sound and plenty of bands with the indie tag that were on major labels. I believe that one of the largest contributors to this was the presence of online music blogs like Pitchfork and Paste that were massively influential through the late 2000s and early 2010s. While Pitchfork was primarily a review outlet, they also became tastemakers for the indie scene. Earning the best new music title on a new album was almost guaranteed to result in a massive increase in album and ticket sales. Arcade Fire released their debut album Funeral on September 14, 2004, after about a year of practicing and playing shows as a band. They were still largely unknown before the album release. Pitchfork released their review of the album 2 days before the album came out, giving it a 9.7 out of 10, and have largely been credited with helping to propel that album to widespread recognition and success. There are countless other examples of this over time, but almost as importantly, Pitchfork acted as sort of these gatekeepers of quote-unquote good music or music worthy of listening to. Pitchfork reviews did largely focus on independent music. Just look at the recent review list around the time that Arcade Fire album released. But don't be mistaken, there are still major label acts here. Bjork, Modest Mouse, Radiohead, you get the point. When Pitchfork gave these mainstream acts high ratings, it was almost like a label saying, "You're okay with the cool kids," blurring the line between true independent artists and the majors. In a similar way, they could kind of serve as gatekeepers. The infamous Jet Shine On review gave the band a 0, and the review exclusively featured a video of a monkey peeing in its own mouth. There was also Liz Phair's major label debut, which had much more polished pop songwriting than her previous records, and received a 0 from Pitchfork in true elitist fashion. Music blogs were also huge during this time, with sites like Hype Machine and Music for Robots contributing to the emergence of the terms blog rock and blog house to describe a lot of the indie sleaze bands in the mid to late 2000s. There's no doubt that internet culture was critical in defining the image of the indie scene. And of course, we can't forget about the indie aesthetic, which included hipster subculture and the indie sleaze fashion style that was largely associated with indie music. We all know the hipster starter pack: flannel shirts, boots, handlebar mustaches, big plastic glasses, fixed gear bikes, and microbrews. While not a direct result of the music at the time, it was certainly associated with it. Not too dissimilar to bands who signed to indie labels to maintain creative control, hipsters at least initially embraced authenticity and uniqueness while eventually becoming what they claimed to hate all along. When the average well-adjusted person sees a band look like this in 2025, they probably feel intense anger. While the two aren't synonymous, indie sleaze was an aesthetic popular with the hipster subculture. Think the Strokes in that 2002 concert. 1970s and 80s fashion mixed with some grunge taken to the max. Bodysuits, leather jackets, big glasses, sheer tops, necklaces, skinny jeans, and big hair. American Apparel was a staple and leader in this aesthetic, alongside bands like Yeah Yeah Yeahs. The style got a further boost in popularity as the electronic influence bands like MGMT, LCD Sound System, and Crystal Castles adopted similar fashion while creating music that could be danced to and played at parties and clubs. Much like the music blogs we talked about, fashion blogs like Cobra Snake captured the indie sleaze nightlife, including celebrities like Kanye West, Mary-Kate and Ashley, and Kate Moss, further popularizing not only the style, but also the music. While Charlie XCX helped popularize indie sleaze again with the release of Brat in 2024, everyone still hates hipsters and hipster culture. It's going to be a while before we're ready for the hipster resurgence. Indie got big enough in the 2000s and 2010s to have a considerable impact on mainstream music and culture. Since You've Been Gone by Kelly Clarkson borrows maybe a little too much from Yeah Yeah Yeah's Maps.
Hear me say, it's how I picture me back up. I'm straight.
Same key signature and a very similar guitar riff, to which Karen O said, if it wasn't her, it would have been Ashley Simpson. Beach House's Silver Soul is the main sample in Kendrick Lamar's Money Trees, which appeared on his major label debut, Good Kid, Mad City. Then you had artists like Bon Iver, who went on to collaborate with Kanye West, Father John Misty with Lady Gaga, and Vampire Weekend's Ezra Koenig with Beyonce, just to name a few. And we can't forget how much influence Jack Antonoff has had on mainstream music, injecting his more stripped down indie sound into songs and albums by Taylor Swift, Lorde, and Lana Del Rey, among others. Love him or hate him, he has made an impact and borrowed from the indie rock playbook. Indie's not so short time in the spotlight definitely started to wind down in the late 2010s, and we're seeing a true return to form in 2025 with actual indie bands like Wet Leg breaking into the mainstream rather than mainstream bands cosplaying as indie. If you enjoyed learning about the cultural impact of the indie rock movement, check out these other videos that explore the music, bands, and subcultures that inspired the creation of zines in the past.